Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a tale of love, loss, and the search for truth. A police officer, haunted by the disappearance of his daughter in a devastating storm, is confronted with an impossible twist of fate when he meets a young woman who looks uncannily like the daughter he lost. Is it her? Or is it someone else entirely? Join us as we explore the emotional journey of discovery, healing, and the bonds that defy time. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and start this incredible story with us today. It was supposed to be just another quiet shift. Like any other day, the rain drummed lightly against the patrol car's windshield as I drove along the empty road. A familiar rhythm that often lulled me into the routine of it all. I hadn't been able to sleep much the night before. As usual, the absence of Emily, my daughter, haunted me even in my dreams. The house felt hollow without her. And no matter how many years passed, the grief never seemed to fully fade. She had vanished 2 years ago during that storm. A force of nature that had swept her from my life. Declared dead by the authorities. There was no trace of her, no body, no evidence. Just a gaping hole in my heart that no amount of time could heal. I was on my patrol when I noticed a weathered, old station wagon weaving slightly across the road. The kind of thing you see on the backroads often, someone who's maybe had a few too many drinks. Or worse, is too tired to be driving. It wasn't unusual. But something about the vehicle caught my attention. The blue paint was faded, chipped in places. I flicked on the lights, signaling for the car to pull over. As the station wagon slowed and moved to the shoulder, I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was what I had been trained for, but today felt different. Today, there was a sense of something bigger brewing in the air, though I couldn't quite place my finger on it. The rain had been coming down steadily now, soaking through my uniform as I stepped out of the car and walked to the driver's side. The window creaked open, revealing a man in his late 60s. With grey hair and a face that seemed carved from the hard realities of time. His eyes were kind, though tired, and there was an easy warmth in his smile, despite the circumstances. "Afternoon, officer," the man said in a voice that had the steady calm of someone who'd seen much of life's trials. "Name's Charles Evans. Was I doing something wrong?" I kept my tone professional but tried to match his calm demeanor. "Good afternoon, Mr. Evans. You were weaving a bit back there. License and registration, please." "Of course," he replied, reaching for his wallet with a slight tremor in his hands. "Sorry about that. Been driving for a while. And it's been a long day. My niece and I got displaced by the storms down south. We're heading to stay with family up here." I nodded and looked towards the backseat as I waited for the paperwork. There, sitting quietly, was a young woman. No older than 19 or 20, with dark hair falling past her shoulders. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her gaze cast out the window. Her presence seemed ordinary enough. But something about her sent a jolt through my chest. She turned her head slowly, and as her eyes met mine, the world seemed to stop. Those eyes. I knew those eyes. They were the same as Emily's. Same warm brown color. Same slight tilt at the corners. The same little fleck of gold in the left iris. The one I used to tease her about calling it her special star. My heart slammed in my chest. For a split second, I felt like I was drowning in a flood of memories. My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. My mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible. This couldn't be Emily, could it? No, it was impossible. She was gone, lost to the storm. Declared dead. I forced myself to focus, trying to keep my hand steady as I took the paperwork from Mr. Evans. Everything seemed fine. His information checked out. His license current. The vehicle registered. Nothing seemed wrong except for the girl in the back seat. I looked at her again, my hands trembling as I handed back the paperwork. "Everything looks fine, Mr. Evans," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Drive safely." Roads can be tricky in this weather. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked back to my patrol car. A million questions raced through my mind, none of which had answers. Could this girl really be Emily? Was it possible that somehow, against all odds, she had survived? And if she was, then why didn't she recognize me? Why was she with this man? The rain followed me as I made my way home, drumming against the car's windows like the beat of a heart that had stopped beating long ago. When I arrived at my front door, I barely noticed the wetness of my clothes, my mind completely consumed by the girl in the station wagon. I hadn't even asked her name. I had barely spoken to her. I moved through the house, the familiar silence pressing in on me. My eyes drifted to the hallway as I passed Emily's old room. The door stood slightly ajar, just like it had for the past 2 years. The small pink room was untouched, frozen in time. The teddy bear on her bed, Mr. Snuggles, sat there, its black button eyes staring up at me with an eerie quietness. I had never been able to put it away. I never could. Next to the bed, her yellow rain boots stood, just as she had left them, painted with flowers by her. One rainy afternoon, I whispered to the empty room, even though I knew she wouldn't answer. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, as I had every day since the storm. The small crayon drawing on the refrigerator caught my eye. It was faded now, but I could still make out the image, 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Daddy and me, Emily had written in wobbly letters, each one a different color. My throat tightened as I remembered her proud smile when she showed it to me. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the drawing, unable to tear my eyes away from the faded, childish scrawl. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the fullness of the grief that had settled in my chest. I missed her more than words could say. Later, at the police station, I tried to focus on the cases in front of me. I buried myself in paperwork, the weight of my emotions too heavy to confront directly. As much as I tried, though, the image of the girl from the station wagon haunted me. Could she really be Emily? Sean Miller, my partner, came by my desk in the afternoon. His voice broke through my fog of thoughts. "Hey, Jack. There's a new place downtown. Great sandwiches. Want to grab lunch later?" I managed a small smile. "Thanks, Sean. But I've got reports to catch up on." Sean gave me a concerned look, but I waved him off. I couldn't let myself think about it, not yet. Not while there was still work to be done. But in the pit of my stomach, the question burned: what if she was my daughter? What if she was alive? The rain hadn't let up, and the endless drip of water against the windows made everything feel even heavier than it already was. The storm that had taken my daughter, Emily, all those years ago, was still there, lurking in the corners of my mind. But that day, the rain wasn't just an echo of the past, it was a new storm brewing. I couldn't stop thinking about that girl, the one in the backseat of the station wagon. Annabelle. Mr. Evans had called her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow connected to Emily. I found myself tossing and turning in bed that night, my mind racing with questions, scenarios, and possibilities. Could this be the break I had been waiting for? Could this girl, so similar to Emily, be her? The resemblance was too strong to ignore, yet I was afraid to hope. After all, I had lost her once before, and I wasn't sure I could survive it again. What if it wasn't her? What if this was just some twisted coincidence that I was reading too much into? I didn't sleep at all that night, the hours slipping by as I stared at the ceiling, thinking, imagining, wondering. By morning, I knew I had to act. I couldn't let this slip away. If there was even the slightest chance that Annabelle was my daughter, I needed to find out. I didn't bother with breakfast. I left the house in a rush, grabbing my jacket and keys before heading straight for the police station. The thought of sitting in my empty house, surrounded by the ghost of Emily's absence, felt suffocating. I needed to move. To do something. Anything that would get me closer to the truth. The station was quieter than usual. The hum of fluorescent lights above creating a sterile atmosphere that matched the emptiness I felt inside. Sean wasn't in yet. So I had the office to myself. I sat down at my desk and tried to focus. The paperwork. The reports, they should have been enough to distract me. But every time I glanced at the desk, my eyes would drift to the photo of Emily that I kept hidden in the drawer. The photo from before the storm. Her smiling face bright and full of life. I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she had looked at me. The way those eyes had seemed to recognize me. Even though I hadn't said a word to her. And yet, she had acted like a complete stranger. It was like she didn't remember me at all. Maybe that's what hurt the most. The girl had the face of my daughter. The eyes that once held all the joy and wonder in the world. But she didn't remember me. She didn't know who I was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And that gnawing feeling led me to do something I had been avoiding for months. I picked up the phone and called my old partner. Sean. Sean. I said when he picked up. I need your help. There's something I need to investigate. Sean was always there for me. No matter how crazy the idea sounded. He knew about Emily, about everything, and I could hear the concern in his voice when I mentioned the girl from the station wagon. You sure about this? Jack, he asked. His voice low. I mean, you know what you're looking for, right? I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. I have to be sure, Sean. I can't just let this go. If there's even the slightest chance. I know, he cut me off. I'll meet you at the diner in an hour. We'll talk then. I hung up the phone. A sense of urgency rushing through me. I couldn't wait another minute. I had to know the truth. I arrived at the diner a little earlier than planned. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The familiar smell of coffee and frying bacon greeting me. Sean was already sitting in a booth. His back to the window. He looked up as I walked over. His expression serious. Jack, he said. His tone low. Talk to me. I slid into the booth across from him and laid out everything I had learned so far, the stop. The girl. The uncanny resemblance to Emily. I told him about the fleeting recognition in her eyes. About the sense that I had stumbled onto something bigger than myself. You think she could be her? Sean asked quietly. His brow furrowed. I don't know, Sean. I replied, shaking my head. But I can't ignore it. It's like the storm that took her didn't just take her body. What if it took her memories, too? What if this girl is my daughter? But she can't remember who she is. Sean looked at me for a long moment. As if weighing my words. What's your plan? I don't know yet. I said honestly. I need to find out more about her. About her background. I need to figure out where she came from and why she doesn't recognize me. I have to be sure before I do anything. Sean nodded slowly. We'll figure it out. You're not alone in this, Jack. His words were like a lifeline. Something solid in the midst of the storm. I didn't feel so lost anymore. With Sean's help, I knew I could get to the truth. We left the diner together. The rain still coming down in heavy sheets outside. As we headed back to the station, I couldn't help but think about Emily, about everything I had lost and everything I might still have a chance to find again. The rain was relentless as we drove through the quiet streets of the town. The soft thud of the windshield wipers was the only sound inside the car, making the world outside seem distant and muffled. My thoughts, however, were anything but quiet. They raced through every possible scenario, each one more desperate than the last. Could this girl, Annabelle, really be Emily? Was this all just a twisted coincidence? Or had the storm taken something much worse than her life? Sean was quiet beside me, as if he could feel the weight of my questions hanging in the air between us. He'd always been good at sensing when I was deep in thought. But this was different. This wasn't just a case, this was my daughter. Or at least the possibility of her. I had been living in a haze of grief for years. Always wondering if Emily was out there somewhere. alive and waiting for me to find her. Now, there was a chance that she had been right in front of me all along. We pulled up to the station. The old building looming in the rain like a monument to my years as a cop. Inside, the usual hustle and bustle of the department was barely noticeable as I made my way to my desk. I could feel the weight of the world on my shoulders as I sat down, pulling out the file that I had been avoiding for months. The missing persons case for Emily. It had been closed, declared a cold case after all these years. But in my heart, I had never given up hope. The photo of Emily, the last one taken before the storm, stared up at me from the file. Her bright, innocent smile was so real, so full of life. And then the storm had come. And everything had changed. The world had shattered. And I had lost her. Or at least, I thought I had. But now, with Annabelle in the back of Mr. Evans' car, I wasn't so sure anymore. I flipped through the case file, my fingers trembling as I skimmed the reports. There was nothing new. Nothing that could explain why a girl, who looked so much like Emily, was living under a different name with a man who claimed to be her uncle. I could feel the frustration building inside me. I needed answers. And I needed them now. Sean's voice broke through my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. You want to head out to talk to Mr. Evans again? Maybe get a more detailed background on this Annabelle? I nodded, grateful for Sean's unwavering support. Yeah. Let's go. I can't shake the feeling that there's something more to this. We drove out to the small cabin on the outskirts of town. The rain had stopped, but the world still felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath. When we arrived, Mr. Evans was sitting on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up as we pulled in, his eyes wary but not unwelcoming. I could see the lines of exhaustion on his face, the weight of the past few years pressing down on him, just as it had been pressing down on me. Officer Porter. Mr. Evans greeted me, his voice quiet but firm. What can I do for you today? I took a deep breath. I need to ask you more about Annabelle. I'm trying to understand everything about her, where she came from. What happened the day you found her? It's important. Mr. Evans set his coffee down, his eyes searching mine. He seemed to know, in that moment, that this wasn't just about a missing persons case anymore. It was personal. He stood up and led us into the cabin, where Annabelle sat at the kitchen table, drawing quietly. When she looked up, I couldn't help but feel a pang in my chest. The resemblance to Emily was uncanny, those same dark eyes, the same delicate features. But there was no recognition in her gaze. She didn't remember me. She didn't remember anything from her past life. Annabelle. Mr. Evans said gently. This is Officer Porter. He's got some questions for you. She looked at me, her face blank, as though she was unsure of who I was or why I was standing there. I took a step forward, trying to keep my voice calm, trying to keep my emotions in check. I had to stay professional. I had to get answers. Annabelle. I began softly. Do you remember anything about the storm? The one that took your family? Her eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, or confusion. She looked away, her fingers twisting around the edge of her drawing pad. I don't remember, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I remember being scared, but I don't remember anything else. I felt my heart sink. Could this really be Emily? Could the trauma of the storm have stolen her memories? We think you might be someone else, I said quietly, unable to stop the words from tumbling out. We think you might be Emily Porter, my daughter. Annabelle's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she clutched the drawing pad. No, she said, shaking her head. I'm Annabelle Evans. I don't know who Emily Porter is. My stomach twisted with the pain of those words. How could she not remember? How could she not know who she was? Mr. Evans stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder in a protective gesture. I've told you, Officer Porter. Annabelle doesn't know anything about her past. She doesn't remember anything from before the storm. She was just a girl who got lost. And I took her in. I stood there, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. Could this be Emily? I had no way of knowing for sure. But everything about Annabelle, the way she looked, the way she acted, the way she seemed to recognize me, even if she couldn't say it, told me that there was more to this story. And I was determined to find out what that was. I'll find the truth, I whispered to myself, more to reassure myself than anyone else. I had to. I couldn't lose her again. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty and longing. Every moment felt suspended in time, as though I was waiting for something, anything, that would prove my suspicion right. The hope that Annabelle could be Emily was both a comfort and a curse. Every time I looked at her, the familiar features pulled at my heart. But the lack of recognition, the distance in her eyes, crushed me all over again. I spent hours going through the old case files, retracing every step of the investigation that had led to Emily being presumed dead. But there were no new clues, no new leads, no way to explain the uncanny resemblance between Annabelle and Emily. It was maddening. The past was a closed book, and I was stuck between two worlds, one where my daughter was lost forever, and one where I might still have a chance to bring her home. Sean could see the toll it was taking on me. He had been my partner for years. And even though he was trying to remain supportive, I knew he was worried. We met at a diner late one evening. The familiar clink of silverware and hum of conversation in the background. But neither of us was really listening. "You need to take a step back," Sean said, his voice quiet but firm. "You can't keep running yourself ragged over this. You've got to give yourself a break before you drive yourself mad." I shook my head, pushing my coffee cup aside. "I can't, Sean. Not this time. If there's even a chance that Annabelle is Emily, I need to know. I can't walk away from this. Not again." Sean exhaled slowly, as though he knew there was no way to talk me out of it. He reached over and placed a hand on my arm. "Just be careful. Don't lose sight of yourself in this search. If she is your daughter, you need to be in the right frame of mind to help her. You can't help anyone if you're falling apart." I appreciated his concern, but it was hard to listen when every fiber of my being was consumed with the need for answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was out there, just beyond my reach. The following morning, I found myself at the edge of town once again, standing outside the small cabin where Annabelle had been living with Mr. Evans. The rain had returned, a steady drizzle that matched the heaviness in my heart. But I wasn't there for the weather. I was there to speak with Joe Evans again. There had to be more he wasn't telling me. When I knocked on the door, Joe answered immediately, his tired eyes scanning me briefly before he stepped aside. He looked even older than the last time I saw him, his face drawn with worry. I didn't need to ask him how he was, it was written all over him. "Come on in, Officer Porter," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Annabelle's in the back, doing some drawing. You can talk to her if you want." I nodded, following him inside. As we moved through the cabin, I couldn't help but notice the quiet, almost sacred atmosphere that surrounded the place. It was as though it was built on memories, on things left unsaid, waiting to be uncovered. When we reached the small room where Annabelle was sitting, she looked up from her drawing. She was still so quiet, so withdrawn. But there was something different about her that day. Maybe it was the way she tilted her head slightly when she saw me, as though she was trying to place me. Or maybe it was the way she didn't look away this time. It was small, but it was something. "Annabelle," I said, my voice soft but steady, "I need to ask you some more questions. It's important. And I need your help." She didn't speak right away, but her eyes softened. She nodded slowly, as though she was willing to listen. I took a seat across from her, my hands resting on my knees, trying to calm my racing thoughts. "I know this is difficult," I continued, "but I need to ask you about your past. The storm, do you remember anything from that day? Anything at all?" Annabelle hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her drawing pad. "I don't remember much," she said quietly, her voice tinged with confusion. "Just that it was really dark. And I was scared. I remember the rain, and the wind. It was loud. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I could hear Emily's voice in my head. The memory of that last time we were together before the storm tore everything apart. And now here was Annabelle, sitting in front of me, looking so much like her, yet so far away. "Do you remember your family?" I asked, bracing myself for her answer. Annabelle looked down, her fingers twitching. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've always been with Uncle Joe. He's the only family I know." Uncle Joe. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust him. But the more I spoke to Annabelle, the more I felt like there was something he wasn't telling me. He wasn't being completely honest. And neither was Annabelle. She wasn't ready to remember. But there was something in her that was trying to reach out. She just needed the right push. "I know it's hard," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "But if you can remember anything at all, it could help me understand. It could help us all." Annabelle sat silently for a long moment. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something in them, something that resembled recognition. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "I'll try," she said quietly. And that was all I needed. That was the thread I needed to follow. I wasn't going to stop. I couldn't stop. Because somewhere, deep inside, I knew the truth was waiting for me. The days that followed were a mixture of hope and anxiety. I couldn't stop thinking about Annabelle's words, "I'll try." It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a tiny spark of recognition, a flicker of light in the dark. And for someone who had lived in the shadows of grief for so long, it felt like a lifeline. But as much as I wanted to rush forward, to force the truth out of her, I knew that wasn't the answer. I had to let Annabelle set the pace. Allow her the time and space she needed to remember. If that was even possible. But it wasn't easy. Every time I looked at her, every time I saw the resemblance to Emily, my heart would race. I needed answers. And I needed them now. Joe Evans had been kind to me, but there was a growing unease in my gut every time I saw him. I couldn't ignore it. Something about him didn't sit right. He was protective of Annabelle. Yes. But there was also something else. Something unspoken. The more I observed him, the more I felt like he was hiding something. I had to dig deeper. One morning, after a restless night of barely sleeping, I found myself at the small cafe where I often met Sean. The weight of the uncertainty was too much to bear. I needed someone to talk to. Someone who could help me make sense of everything that was happening. When Sean saw me walk in, he immediately knew something was wrong. He raised an eyebrow and gestured for me to sit down. "Something on your mind, partner?" he asked, his voice low and casual, but his eyes sharp with concern. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to gather my thoughts. I can't shake this feeling that Joe is hiding something. I don't know if it's just my instincts as a cop or something else. But it's eating away at me. Sean studied me for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You've been thinking about this a lot, haven't you? Every minute of every day," I confessed, feeling the weight of the words. "I need to find out the truth, Sean. I can't keep living in this limbo." Sean nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "I get it. But remember, this isn't just about finding the truth for yourself. It's about Annabelle, too. Whatever you uncover, it could affect her in ways you're not ready for." I knew he was right. But the truth felt like an obsession I couldn't escape. The thought of Emily, my daughter, still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found, it was a reality I couldn't ignore. "I need to talk to Joe again," I said, determination building in my chest. "I can't rest until I know for sure what happened that night." Sean sighed but didn't argue. He knew me too well. "Just be careful, Winston. You're walking a fine line here. Don't push too hard. The next day, I found myself back at Joe's cabin, the familiar tension creeping into my body as I approached the door. Joe greeted me with his usual warm smile, but there was a nervousness behind it that didn't go unnoticed. "Good to see you, Officer Porter," he said, his voice tight but friendly. "Annabelle's in the back, drawing. You're welcome to come in and talk." I followed him inside, my heart pounding with every step. This time, I wasn't here to ask Annabelle questions. This time, I was going straight to the source. "Joe," I said, once we were seated across from one another, "I need you to be honest with me. I can't keep going around in circles. Did you really find Annabelle after the storm? Or is there something more you're not telling me?" Joe's eyes widened slightly, his hands fidgeting with the cup in front of him. I could see the shift in his expression. The guard he had up slipping ever so slightly. He wasn't expecting me to ask this question. "Winston, I've told you everything I know," Joe said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying him. "She was alone. I found her after the storm. Confused. Scared. She didn't remember anything. I took her in because no one else was around. She was just a scared kid. I wasn't buying it." "Joe, I'm not accusing you of anything. But there are too many unanswered questions here. The resemblance between Annabelle and my daughter, Emily, there's something that doesn't add up. You need to tell me everything." Joe's face paled, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. It was as if the words were stuck in his throat, unwilling to come out. I didn't know what else to do. "Winston," he said quietly, "I thought she was lost forever. I thought no one would come looking for her. She needed someone. I couldn't just leave her." I leaned forward, my gaze intense. "What do you mean, Joe? You think no one would come looking for her? Why would you think that?" Joe's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Because she was alone, Winston. She was alone in the water. The storm was so bad. I couldn't even see the road. No one would have found her in that mess. I didn't think anyone was left." The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. Could it be? Had Annabelle truly been lost in the storm? Just like my daughter? The idea felt wrong. But it was the only explanation that made sense. Joe had kept her safe. But at what cost? I stood up abruptly, the sudden realization flooding my mind. There were more pieces to this puzzle than I'd ever imagined, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face them. "I need more time, Joe," I said, my voice shaky. "I need to figure this out. For all of us." As I left the cabin, the rain began to fall harder, drenching me in the steady downpour. The world seemed to spin as I tried to process everything Joe had just told me. But one thing was clear: I couldn't let go of the hope that Annabelle might be Emily. No matter what the truth turned out to be, I had to know. And with that determination, I set out to find the answers, no matter the cost. The following days were a blur of conflicting emotions. The air in the house seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. I couldn't focus, couldn't sit still. Everywhere I went, my mind kept drifting back to Annabelle, and that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me something was amiss. It wasn't just her resemblance to Emily, though that was haunting enough. It was the way Joe seemed to avoid certain questions, how he flinched at the mention of the storm. I knew I had to press on, even if it meant pushing into uncomfortable territory. The fear of never knowing, of losing the chance to find out if this girl truly was my daughter, was unbearable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily's face, the way her brown eyes would light up when she smiled, the way she used to laugh when I told her silly stories before bed. I couldn't stop myself from hoping that, somehow, this quiet, withdrawn girl was my Emily. I decided to take matters into my own hands. One morning, I drove to the local library, hoping to find something that would help connect the dots between Annabelle's past and Emily's disappearance. I hadn't been back there in years. Not since the investigation had come to a halt. But today, I needed something more. I needed the truth. I spent hours poring over old news articles, clippings about the storm, the destruction it caused, the missing people. I couldn't focus on anything but the storm's aftermath, the chaos that had ensued in the wake of it. The more I read, the more questions I had. There were reports of missing people. Yes. But nothing concrete. No names that stood out. No leads that pointed to Annabelle. Frustration gnawed at me. But just as I was about to leave, a specific headline caught my eye. It was buried deep in a local paper. An article about the storm, with a sidebar about a search effort. It was a single line, tucked between paragraphs about flooding and property damage. But it made my heart skip a beat. A young girl, presumed dead after being swept away by storm surge, was never found. Her family has requested the authorities end the search. My hands trembled as I read the words again. The details were chillingly familiar. A young girl, presumed dead. No body recovered. Her family pushing for closure. Was this Emily? Could it be? I sat there for a long time, unable to think clearly. My mind was reeling with the implications of what I had just read. Annabelle's story seemed to line up with everything that had happened. And yet, I was still unsure. The storm had stolen so much from me already, my daughter, my peace of mind, my ability to move on. Could it be that the storm had taken not just her, but my hope as well? I didn't have time to process the discovery. I needed to talk to Joe. I needed answers. And I needed them now. I found myself back at Joe's cabin that afternoon. The rain had finally stopped, and the skies had cleared, but the weight of everything still hung in the air. When Joe opened the door, I could see that something was off. His eyes were tired, his posture stiff, as if he knew what was coming. "Winston," he said, his voice hoarse. "You look like you've seen a ghost. I need to talk to you." "Joe," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been doing some digging. I came across something today, something that's making me question everything." Joe's face faltered for a moment before he gestured for me to come inside. I followed him into the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either make sense or come crashing down. "I'm listening," Joe said quietly, sitting down across from me. "What did you find?" I took a deep breath, the words heavy in my throat. "I found an article about the storm. It mentioned a young girl, presumed dead. But her body was never found. Her family asked for the search to be ended. The details, Joe, they match Annabelle's story. They match Emily's disappearance." Joe didn't speak right away. His hands clenched around the edge of his chair, his knuckles white. It was clear he was struggling with something, but I couldn't tell what. The silence stretched between us like a wall. "Winston," he finally said, his voice low, "I never told you everything. I should have. But I didn't know how." I felt a chill run down my spine. I could see it in his eyes, guilt, pain, fear. He was hiding something. And now it was time for him to face the truth. "Joe, what are you saying?" I demanded, my voice breaking slightly. "What happened? What really happened that night?" Joe looked away, as though the weight of my words was too much to bear. "I found Annabelle that night. She was lost, disoriented. She didn't remember anything except being swept away by the storm. But she was alive. Winston. I couldn't just leave her. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought maybe, just maybe, her family wouldn't come looking. And I didn't know what else to do." The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. Joe hadn't just been trying to protect Annabelle from the storm, he had been trying to protect himself from the truth. From the possibility that the girl he had saved wasn't just any girl, but my daughter. I had to make a choice. "Winston," Joe continued, his voice cracking. "I couldn't let her go. I couldn't let her be lost like that." My mind was racing. My heart pounding in my chest. I had to know. I needed confirmation. Joe. Is she Emily? Please. Just tell me the truth. Joe's silence was deafening. Finally. He looked up at me. His face a mask of sorrow. I think she might be. But she doesn't remember. Winston. And I don't think she ever will. She's not the same girl she was. It was as though my entire world had come crashing down in that moment. The girl I had been searching for all these years. The one I had lost to the storm. Might be right in front of me. But she didn't remember. She couldn't remember. I sat there in stunned silence. The weight of everything pressing down on me. Joe was right, Annabelle wasn't the same. She wasn't the girl I had once known. The girl I had loved so deeply. But maybe, just maybe, she could become her again. As Winston continued to spend time with Annabelle, his daughter's memories slowly began to resurface. It wasn't easy, each step forward was met with challenges, but the small moments of recognition were enough to fuel his hope. Through patience, love, and the support of those around him, the bond between father and daughter was rebuilt. Despite the years lost, Winston refused to give up on the chance to heal. Not just for Annabelle, but for himself too. The past no longer held the same weight as before. They were no longer defined by the storm, but by their strength to rebuild, to cherish each new memory made. The healing journey was far from over. But with every step, Winston knew they were closer to the truth, and to a future filled with hope. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories.